The soundstage at Studios de Boulogne sat in near darkness except for a single spotlight. Brigitte Bardot stood at its center, wearing an elaborate period gown that took three assistants 40 minutes to lace. The director had already called for quiet twice, but the murmur of crew voices continued behind the lights. Someone dropped a metal clamp near the dolly track. The costume weighed 17 pounds. The corset beneath it restricted her breathing to shallow pulls. She had been standing in that exact position for 22 minutes while the lighting crew adjusted gels and scrims. The makeup artist had touched up her face 4 times, each visit adding another layer to skin that already felt thick with foundation. A production assistant approached with a glass of water, then retreated without offering it. The first assistant director checked his watch. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the lights, a phone rang twice and stopped. No one answered it. Was this the moment everything changed? Had the industry always worked this way? Or was something breaking? Could one decision in one room shift an entire system? If this story challenges something you believe about how power works in cinema, hit subscribe. We examine the moments that rewrote the rules. We don't look away from what actually happened. This is a fictional reconstruction of events from Brigitte Bardot's career era, created for educational purposes. Secondary characters and specific dialogue have been dramatized. Brigitte Bardot had signed the contract 6 months earlier in an office overlooking the setting. The producer sat behind a desk made of dark wood, the papers already arranged in 3 neat stacks. She read every page while he watched. The silence lasted 11 minutes. When she signed, she used a fountain pen he provided, and the ink was still wet when he pulled the document back across the desk. The film had been pitched as an intimate character study. Small crew, natural locations, emphasis on performance over spectacle. The director's previous work had won acclaim at Venice. During their first meeting, he spoke about collaboration, about actors bringing their instincts to the material, about trust. He used the word partnership 3 times in 20 minutes. Rehearsals began in late spring. The read-throughs happened in a rehearsal hall with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked. Bardot arrived early each day. Script annotated in the margins with her own notes. The director nodded as she offered interpretations. He smiled. He said, "Yes, exactly." He never disagreed once during those 3 weeks. Production started in July. The first location was a villa in the countryside, and the weather cooperated. Morning shoots went smoothly. The director watched playback after each take and gave concise notes. The crew worked with practiced efficiency. Bardot's performance felt alive, responsive, unforced. By the end of week 2, they were ahead of schedule. Then the money became a problem. The original investors pulled funding after seeing rough cuts. New financiers came in with conditions. One of them visited the set during week 3, stood behind the director's chair, and said nothing for 2 hours, just watched. His assistant took notes on a leather-bound pad. They left before lunch without speaking to anyone. The production moved to the Paris studio for interior scenes. The schedule became compressed. 12-hour days became 14, then 16. The intimacy of the early shoots disappeared. The crew doubled in size. Executives started appearing on set, standing in clusters near the monitors. The director's tone changed. His notes grew longer. His pauses between takes stretched. Bardot noticed the shift during a scene in a bedroom set. She had played it 3 different ways in 3 takes, each one offering a new dimension to the moment. The director called cut, then walked to the monitors without looking at her. He spoke with 2 men in suits for 7 minutes. When he returned, he asked her to do it again, exactly as she had in take 1. He said exactly twice. The next morning, the script pages in her trailer were different from the ones she had received the night before. 3 scenes had been rewritten. The changes were small but specific. Her character's dialogue shortened, her choices narrowed, her agency reduced. A note paper clipped to the front said, "Per discussion with production, approved revisions." No signature. The director's previous film had been an actor's showcase. This one, she began to see, was being shaped by different hands. The executives appeared more frequently. Their visits coincided with the director's script changes. One afternoon, she saw him in the hallway outside his office, leaning against the wall, eyes closed. He didn't move when people walked past. The studio had final cut. The investors had approval over casting and major creative decisions. The contract she had signed gave them those rights in paragraphs she had read, but perhaps not fully weighted. The producer who had sat across from her in that office with the Seni view never visited the set. His assistant delivered messages through the first AD. The morning of the confrontation began with a wardrobe fitting that ran long. The costume department had created the period gown based on designs approved by the new investors. It was historically accurate, meticulously researched, and completely wrong for the character as Bardot understood her. The sleeves restricted arm movement. The neckline drew focus to ornamentation rather than face. She stood on the fitting platform while 3 people adjusted pins and made marks with chalk. The director arrived during the fitting. He stood in the doorway and looked at the gown. "It's what they want," he said. His voice carried no inflection. The costume designer glanced between them. No one spoke for a moment. Then the director left without waiting for a response. On set, the atmosphere had weight. The usual pre-shoot conversation among crew members was absent. People moved with contained efficiency, eyes down, focused on their specific tasks. The executives were already there, seated in the director's chairs someone had brought specially. 3 of them. They didn't stand when Bardot arrived. The scene was a pivotal moment, her character making a choice that would determine the film's final act. Bardot had discussed this scene with the director during rehearsals. She had brought ideas. He had listened. They had found something truthful together. But the pages on her mark now contained different blocking, different emphasis, different intention. The changes served the costume. They served the framing the executives wanted. They didn't serve the story. The director called for first positions. Bardot moved to her mark. The gown's train required 2 assistants to arrange properly. The lighting was harsh, theatrical rather than natural. It created shadows that emphasized the costume's elaborate detail. The cinematographer looked through the lens, made a small adjustment, then stepped back without expression. The room went quiet. The first assistant director counted down. The camera rolled. The director said action in a voice that sounded like he was speaking from another room entirely. Bardot delivered the first line, as written on the new pages. She hit the mark where they wanted her to stand. She turned at the prescribed moment. She embodied exactly what the revised blocking demanded. The director called cut. He watched the playback with the executives leaning over his shoulder. One of them pointed at the screen. Another nodded. They spoke in voices too low for the crew to hear. The director stood up. "Again," he said. "Same thing. 5 takes. Each one identical to the last. Each one technically perfect. Each one empty of the truth she had found in rehearsals." After the 5th take, the director called for a break. The executives didn't move from their chairs. They were checking their phones, having a conversation about scheduling, acting as though the work happening in front of them was already finished. All eyes turned when Bardot didn't leave the set. She stood at her mark while the crew began to disperse for the break. The camera operator looked at the first AD. The script supervisor closed her binder. The sound mixer removed his headphones. Bardot's hands went to the costume's closure at her shoulder. It was a simple hook mechanism, designed for quick changes. She found it without looking down. The director was halfway to the monitors when he noticed. He stopped. The executives stopped their conversation. The crew members who had begun walking toward craft services froze in mid-stride. No one moved. Bardot opened the closure. The gown was designed to be removed with assistance, but the top portion released easily enough. She shrugged her shoulders, and the heavy fabric slipped down to her waist. Beneath it, she wore the simple rehearsal clothes she had arrived in that morning, a black turtleneck and trousers. The kind of outfit that let her move, breathe, think. She stepped out of the gown's pooled fabric. The silence in the soundstage was absolute. The director's mouth opened, but no sound came. One of the executives stood up from his chair. The others remained seated, bodies rigid. The costume designer moved forward instinctively, then stopped. Bardot walked to the edge of the light. She picked up the script from the small table near her mark. The pages were crisp, recently printed. She held them at her side. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but in that silence it carried to every corner of the soundstage. "I'll play the scene we rehearsed," she said, "or I won't play it at all." The director looked at the executives. The executives looked at each other. The crew remained frozen in their scattered positions around the set. Someone's walkie-talkie crackled with static. No one responded. The sound cut off. The first executive who had stood up took 2 steps toward the director. He leaned in and whispered something. The director's face showed nothing. He nodded once. The executive returned to his chair but didn't sit down. The director turned to Bardot. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his own script, the one with his original notes still penciled in the margins. He walked to the cinematographer and spoke quietly. The cinematographer nodded and began adjusting the lights. The harsh theatrical shadows disappeared. The illumination became natural again, the kind that revealed a face rather than decorated it. The costume designer approached carefully. "What would you like to wear?" she asked. Bardot gestured to what she was already wearing. "This," she said. The designer nodded and retreated. The executives remained standing. They spoke among themselves in a tight cluster. One of them made a phone call, walking to the edge of the soundstage. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When he returned, he said something to the other two. They collected their belongings. All three left through the side door. They didn't look back. The director called everyone back to first positions. The crew moved with new energy. The set, which had felt dense with pressure minutes before, now felt expansive. The camera operator checked his frame. The script supervisor opened her binder to the original scene. The sound mixer put his headphones back on. Bardot returned to her mark, but the mark itself was different now. The blocking was different. The intention was different. She and the director spoke quietly for 2 minutes, finding the scene again the way they had in rehearsal. When they were ready, she nodded. He stepped back behind the monitor. The camera rolled. The director said, "Action," and this time his voice carried actual presence. Bardot played the scene as she had always understood it. Her performance was unguarded, precise, alive. The camera captured something true. When the director called cut, he didn't look at the playback. He simply said, "Moving on." The rest of the day proceeded without incident. The executives didn't return. The director's notes regained their earlier clarity. The crew worked with renewed focus. By the end of shooting, the film had found its original shape. The version that eventually reached audiences contained the performance Bardot had fought to protect. The industry took notice, though not through press releases or public statements. Directors who had felt similar pressure from financiers began citing contract clauses about creative control. Actors started asking different questions during negotiations. The shift was gradual, almost invisible, but it was real. One person's refusal to compromise had demonstrated what was possible. The lesson wasn't about rebellion for its own sake. It was about knowing the difference between collaboration and capitulation. Bardot had studied the script, understood her character, and done the work during rehearsals. When that work was dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with storytelling, she made a choice. She removed what didn't belong and stood in her truth. The moment on that soundstage lasted less than 3 minutes. The consequences rippled outward for years. Every actor who has since walked off a set over a creative betrayal, every director who has fought for final cut, every crew member who has spoken up when something felt wrong, they're all standing in that same space, Bardot claimed when she stepped out of that gown. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the work itself is worth protecting. The strongest response to pressure isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's simply refusing to wear what doesn't fit. Remember what Brigitte Bardot taught us about integrity. It's measured not in the stands we take when everyone's watching, but in the quiet decisions we make when authority expects compliance. The camera was rolling, the executives were waiting, and she chose truth over approval. That choice is still available to all of us.